Thank you to the Asian Bureau for Finance and Economic Research, ABFAIR, and to Edward Robinson, Bernard Young, and Stephen Davis for having me to give this year's lecture. I am sorry that I cannot be with you in person, and I look forward to our virtual dialogue. Originally, I was scheduled, as befits this group, to talk about monetary policy, but we've since decided as global cooperation that global cooperation in the face of COVID was the better topic. It is a very mixed bag at the moment, which is interesting to consider how in the face of what is so common a threat and so obvious a threat, that there has been such a mix of success in terms of global coordination and failure. The successes in particular have been in the monetary sphere, where of course many of the people watching this lecture and participating in this year's virtual conference are engaged. And this is to some degree heartening, but it's worth examining both what else remains to be done in the sense of making us, the world economy, survive this crisis as best as possible, but also intellectually thinking about what this means for international policy coordination in the economic sphere and what it means for the future. I'm going to be speaking tonight drawing on joint work I've done with a number of colleagues at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in our briefing on the G20 and related work, and in particular discussions and joint work with Maurice Obstfeld of the University of California at Berkeley. But my comments that follow are my own words and my own way of thinking about it. I think, as Bernard Young put it to me, I think it is important to think about the completely non-discriminatory nature of the virus. Older males, fat males like me, of course, are more vulnerable. There are various comorbidities and predilections, but essentially we're all human, and national identities and skin color and such trivialities do not mean anything in the face of the virus. And so this would seem to be the moment to have a global approach that would resonate. There's nothing or very little that should be zero sum about containing the virus. You get almost in health and economic terms to Martin Luther King's view of an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. As we are sadly living through once again in the US, that clearly is not an accepted point of view. And unfortunately, in international economic policy making, that is not yet an accepted view either. That said, I think there is worth us thinking about how, in front of such a common threat, we were able, we meaning the economics community, not us personally, were able to marshal such support and unanimity, not just on the monetary front, but on the fiscal front. In the US, we have such noted budget hawks as Glenn Hubbard and Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart coming out publicly and saying, you know, this is the time for fiscal spending, don't worry about it. And that took many, many observers, including seasoned political and journalist observers, by surprise that there could be such unanimity in the economics profession. Similarly, on the monetary side, except for some very small glitches, we had a shift in the monetary sphere much more rapidly and much greater convergence among policies between the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, Swiss National Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, of course, the People's Bank of China, the Bank of Japan, and so on. The ability of economists to present unity in this situation, I think, is heartening for the profession, especially in contrast to the sometimes divisive and, I think, ignoring of the facts divisions we had 12 years or 10 years ago during the global financial crisis. And that clearly contributed to some of the cooperation we have seen. But to me, it should not be overplayed. I think the economists are to some degree, unfortunately, useful fools for policymakers and politicians. We can at times affect things and advise against bad policies, but it's hard to imagine that us simply being unified was sufficient. Uh, think of the fact that in the WHO and in the public health community, we have this very clear near unanimity and very different response from the political class and the policymakers. This is a point I'll return to a couple times, but so I think we need to go a little bit deeper than just say, well, the policy steps were clear. That's not sufficient. And even more so looking back at 2008 to 2012, where I would argue and did at the time, there were clear policy steps that everyone should have been willing to undertake that were not followed, or were not followed until things were demonstrated for the umpteenth time that they were false, like raising austerity in the middle of a recession. So the intellectual consensus is important. It is definitely not sufficient. It may not even be necessary to getting international cooperation. There is a vast literature, and one of the key contributors is Koichi Mada at Yale, among others, and my former professor, Richard Cooper. And there's been a lot of discussion about getting people, policymakers, or at least their advisors, agreed on the model, agreed on the problem. And again, I think this is salutary, but I think to some degree this misses the point. This is still the technocrats' view. And as well as things have gone from the monetary and even fiscal front in recent times, we should not look at recent cooperation as being the result of a technocratic elite making the decisions. So let's think about, I'm going to try to take you through where I think the international cooperation has and hasn't succeeded in this time of crisis of the, by definition, world's most global common threat, and what that says about future cooperation. And in particular, I think we have to look at how much politics, both international and domestic, matter. Again, this is not obviously new ground. There is a long history of discussion of what are called two-level games, the famous political scientist Robert Putnam bringing that idea out. A number of people who've worked at the Peterson Institute through the decades have worked on this topic. But that, I think, also is, it tends to be something of a misnomer, because what's key is when the domestic politics gets involved or not, because it is very rare that domestic politics has no interest group that would be unharmed by an issue, a commitment made at the international level. So I think it is more fruitful, instead of just saying domestic politics matters, as to focus on two aspects of one is what I'll call international distrust, which is pretty straightforward and of course relates primarily at this point to the relationship between the US and Chinese leaderships, and to a lesser degree between the EU, the other liberal-minded governments' leaderships with China. That current and the rising current of distrust towards the US government under President Trump, that is one aspect of the situation. The other political aspect to be emphasized is, for want of a better word, what I'll call salience. That we as economists tend to often miss the point of when something is important to people and when it is not. And what seems fixed should not be taken as fixed. And I think this is a particular error being made often now in the discussions of globalization, that there is an assumption that the nationalist pushback on globalization somehow is the inevitable limit of people's tolerance for liberalism, or the inevitable result of human nature. And I think this is a very foolish, defeatist point of view. I look a lot at the US, and I'm not going to put up the charts, so you'll have to take this on my word. But you know, it's fascinating, for example, to plot the importance or the regard for A, trade, and B, relations with Russia in the US popular polls. These are both questions that well-established national polling data has tracked for decades. And on trade, it turns out that increasingly through the years, people leaning Democratic side of the party politics have become more favorable to trade, and Republicans have become less favorable. But from the 80s through recently, there was the perception that it was the other way around. And to some degree in congressional politics, that was true, of course, until Trump. And so there's been this very big divergence between what the popular officials thought was going on versus what the populace itself thought. Similarly, on Russia, we had decades of Cold War followed by propaganda, including things of Hollywood movies of years of Russian villains. And the assumption would be that there would be fundamental distrust of Americans for Russians. And yet suddenly in recent years, between social media bots, more overt propaganda, and the efforts of President Trump, there's been a huge surge in the support for a Russia-US rapprochement in the populace, and especially among Republicans. And so both of these topics, which you would think would be related to fundamental policy measures or at least fundamental preferences, turn out to be quite fluid. And this may seem a bit far afield from talking about international policy coordination in response to COVID, but just to emphasize that when we talk about domestic politics, it may not be so much a matter of deep interests or deep preferences, it may be a matter of circumstance. And so while we cannot talk as technocrats and say, you, the people, must do what we tell you, we can also stand up and say, just because an opinion poll says something doesn't mean it is deep and needs to be taken seriously either. So now let me return to the specific topic of how international coordination on policy has been going in this time of the COVID panic. And as Maury Obstfeld and I wrote just ahead of the spring virtual IMF World Bank meetings in early April, we think that there is plenty of room for what we termed mutually binding and beneficial changes in government behavior without significant additional expenditure. In other words, a lot of what can be done and should be done on the international cooperation front is a question of collective action in the classic sense. There are grapes on that tree. Those grapes are out of reach. If you and I stand on each other's shoulders, we can reach the grapes. It is not a zero-sum game. It is not a sequential game of I do something for you now, you do something for me later. It is not a complementarities game. It is just literally collective action. And that is the way, I think, given the common threat of the virus, we need to think about most of the opportunities that are available for cooperation. This is, in a sense, about expanding the possibility set. It's not about trade-offs in the usual sense that we talk about in economic policy. Is this too optimistic? I don't think so. I think, if anything, it's much more realistic. There is a long history of, again, literature, but also attempts at international coordination on economic policy. The high point, I would argue, was the G20 being created and then effectively utilized, largely under the leadership of then UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown, but obviously with the participation of other leaders, including critically then US President Barack Obama and the then Chinese leadership as well. And I was on the fringes of the G20 effort by Prime Minister Brown and in 2008, 9, and 10. And I think what was critical was, similar to today, you had a commonality of threat. It wasn't something, the financial crisis then, the pandemic now, isn't something that it's external to anyone. and contagion in the economic or now literal sense was a very real threat. And isolation was not going to be entirely practical, although a certain amount of self-insulation was possible, as Singapore demonstrated both then and now. And this commonality of threat puts you in a very interesting space, because then in terms of your policy agenda, as it was the case in 2008 to 10, and should have been the case, and in part was the case right now, is really about all the major governments and those others who have the resources to play along to be pushing in the same direction. Now, this is to be thought of as things like, we all agree not to raise tariffs as we agreed in 2009. Or we all agree to provide dollar liquidity and join into the swap line network, as that was the case just starting 2 months ago. This is a very different conception than, say, what used to be considered a high watermark of international cooperation in 1978, the Bonn Summit, and then subsequent attempts like the Plaza and Louvre Accords of the mid-1980s. Those were instances where it was more about a trade-off. It was not a common approach. It was the US must save more and reduce its trade deficits. Japan and Germany must spend more and reduce their trade surpluses. And of course, these things did not really happen. The agreements were not fulfilled. Even after the fact, there was great dispute between the governments about who lived up to the agreements, and then to the degree they were lived up to, whether they had the desired effect. And so to me, these are very different in nature types of international cooperation. And generally, many of the frustrations that US and other governments have had going into the G7 and then the G20 or other fora for international cooperation have usually been because they're about the sequential surveillance or the sequential bargaining. In turn, I will do this when you do this now. And as simple as it is, that's a very different proposition than, let's all of us right now agree not to do X, or all of us agree now we will do Y. And so it's interesting to reflect back that between 2010 and this year, there was very little achieved at the G20 level beyond technocratic agreements, except notably the agreement against currency manipulation, unilateral currency intervention, that the G7 and then extended to China and a few others was negotiated around 2012 going forward. And there again, I think the crucial fact was it was not about keeping economic outcomes determined in some target range, be it an exchange rate or be it a surplus or a trade balance. It was focused on deliverable behaviors, that we will not engage in unilateral foreign exchange intervention. Now, I realize this is a sore point for Singapore, for some other small economies, but I think this has to be counted as a major success that Japan and China and the US and the Europeans and a few other countries have managed to avoid real currency conflict for an extended period. And it is again in this spirit of pushing all the same behavior on everyone and not having numerical targets. And so that emphasis on behaviors rather than outcomes, I think, is another critical component of cooperation. And so when my colleagues at Peterson and I assessed what the G20 agenda should be and how to take it forward, we concentrated on what we felt were 4 components. The first being to increase peer pressure in an effective way for best practice. The second being to stop financial panic in its tracks. We didn't need that opportunistic additional infection on the economy. The third being to prevent mutual aggression between economies and governments who are already suffering from the pandemic. And then the fourth, most critically, ethically and in human terms, to help the poor of the world contend with and survive the pandemic. And if you look at this list, you can put into the different buckets the various policy measures undertaken. I'm not going to go through the whole litany. I will simply say that, again, the monetary field has been an incredible success. And of course, it comes at the start because of a common technical recognition among the central bankers and the people associated with them, and ideally the finance ministries, that preventing a financial panic was doable, that simultaneous rapid action was necessary, that quantitative easing combined with swap lines, combined with direct credit interventions would do the job, that central banks should do that as quickly as possible. I think that all goes straightforwardly. But again, the contrast with what has happened around disclosure of disease, mutual reporting, tracking at borders, membership in the WHO, sharing of information, all of which should have been just as self-evident and just as much a technocratic measure, is very striking. And if you had asked me or anyone, I think, a year or two ago, can you imagine a world in which doctors and public health officials are less trusted than central bankers? You would have been thought absurd. That is not the world we would have thought we were in. And so one has to ask, to some degree, what are the structural factors to create that divide, that the peer pressure and best practice worked in monetary and not in health? And obviously part of it is the domestic politics, but not in the sense of popularity, because who's against health? In the sense of the self-interested acts of nationalist governments who wanted to avoid disclosure or who wanted to avoid panicking their people, or who frankly were wishful and in denial about health conditions, as we know has been the case in a number of countries, not just the US and the UK, but now sadly Brazil and Mexico, for example. An interesting side note is, even in the absence of effective international coordination, the countries which seem to have done well on governance and on health management do not seem to line up well with per capita income, with perceived notions of freedom and government competence. To some degree, yes, but to some degree, no. And this is a study for comparative public policy and social science to be tackled in great detail, I hope, in the coming years. But the important point is our ability to engage in peer pressure remains very limited. And so one has to look to agreements where there is a very set playbook, as was the case in the monetary sphere, and a very easy observable, as again was the case in the monetary sphere. And finally, an observable that didn't in any way imperil the prerogatives of the heads of state, heads of government. That leads to the second issue, the area of stopping financial panic. I think here, rather than talking about the political economy, I would just emphasize 2 points. The first is, we did not know, and still don't quite know, to what extent the incredible outflow of capital from the emerging markets in the developing world would be sustained versus rapidly reversed. If it is mapping public health, the reversal should be already partly underway, because in a number of significant developing countries, the significant in the sense of population and size, all countries are significant. Sizable countries, the death rates and the illness rates have been a fraction of what was expected going in. And so if that is the issue that was driving the outflow of capital, there should be some flowing back, and there are some very partial signs of that happening. But that doesn't seem to be the story, just as bizarrely Brazil and Mexico are not, and for that matter the UK, are not seeing relative deprivation of international capital flows commensurate with their relative poor performance on public health. So there are other forces at work. The second issue about stopping financial panic is, of course, the one that those countries which have the luxury to have bent the curve and stabilized their pandemic situations are now facing, which is that of economic recovery. We have provided fiscal lifelines of one sort or another throughout the world to small businesses and workers, down to a surprising number of developing countries as well as the rich countries. And this was, again, another example of great agreement among the policymakers on the right thing to do. That we are in this mess, despite that, the mess I refer to, of course, being the 100+ countries coming to the IMF and the World Bank for emergency aid as we speak, due to the huge capital outflow, is really quite shocking and troubling. And this is where international cooperation has, of course, failed us. That in the time since the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010, we have made zero progress at changing the governance of the international financial institutions, limited progress of giving them the resources they need, limited progress of making countries less subject to large capital outflows, limited progress in, if not zero, in making countries less dependent on the dollar. So at some point, international cooperation, as we turn to this issue of recovery in the rich countries and preventing financial crisis, is just of limited utility ultimately. It is preventing an opportunistic infection on an already sick patient, but it will not cure the patient. The third area, preventing mutual aggression, is the area that should have been the easiest. We had the roadmap from 2008 to 2010 of agreeing not to engage in protectionist measures. Instead, we have seen some of the most bare-knuckle, brawling kinds of protectionist measures we have seen in decades instituted during this crisis. The EU, of all places, temporarily restricting exports of medical equipment and supplies, various countries putting on export restrictions on food as part of the panic, the US, of course, behaving abysmally in its attempts to corner the market on various things, the outflows of China being highly politicized in terms of who gets what. As my colleague at Peterson, Chad Bown, and Annabelle Gonzalez have clearly argued, there are gains for all to be had from a simple, transparent stockpiling measure and openness on these trade issues. And it would have been very simple to pursue these. In the end, speaking frankly, the rich country people would have been able to get all the ventilators and masks they needed anyway. That was never the issue. The problem is the lack of trust. And again, that's a very soft way for an economist, even a soft economist like me, to speak. But when we speak about the US withdrawing and abdicating its role as a global leader, that somewhat misleads. The issue is that at one time you could count on the US, as they'd say in German, im Großen und Ganzen, largely and overall, to do the right thing, to prevent the full exploitation of people. Now, as we're seeing in the outbreak of legitimate protests in the US, right now, it is absurd to suggest that the US, in some abstract sense, always does the right thing. But the globalization of the late 40s until the last decade was one that generally, for those countries that were part of the system, protected them from too much bullying, put on certain norms of behavior. And that, as I argued starting a couple of years ago, talking about a post-American world economy, is what is the main effect of the US withdrawal. It's not that the trade goes away, it's that the weaker countries get bullied, it's that the policies of the rich countries become politicized. So sad to say, the international cooperation on fighting aggression has not been very successful. In the currency realm, that is held up, although right now that may be just starting to erode between the US and China. I hope not. At this point, it would be in no one's interest to see the dollar rise further, especially for all those countries importing critical supplies and commodities still priced in dollars. Finally, the question of helping the world's poor survive. As I've indicated, in the end, of course, what countries, governments, and the people in them do themselves is the biggest determinant of their resilience. And rich white folks in the North are seeing just how resilient and how resourceful many poor countries are, even in the face of pandemic and global recession. It is very difficult to be at all optimistic in a world where remittances, foreign workers, cross-border investment, orders for low-end goods like fabric and clothing, capital flows, as well as just straight up trade and tourism are being so interfered with. And in a world where, thankfully, I guess the energy prices have come down, but other commodity exporters are very hard struggling as well. And we know what to do in the sense of at least trying to recycle the capital, the work towards a standstill on debt, as my colleagues Anna Gelper and Sean Hagan and Anna Masarai have advocated, and as the IMF MD Georgieva and the World Bank President Malpass have to some degree taken up. This is a critical step forward, but it can't get past the failure to improve governance at the IMF and the World Bank in the first place. So where does that leave us? I guess I'm going to point out what I'll call 6 ironies that have emerged, trying to be a little more intellectual and less of a forecaster or an advocate. The 6 ironies that have emerged from assessing global economic policy coordination in recent times. And by recent times, I mean this year. The first is that secular stagnation which has afflicted so much of the world, I would argue, following Larry Summers, has made it easier for there to be international economic coordination. We have a world in which there are very small interest rate differentials on the nominal side and relatively small interest rate differentials on the real side between the major economies. We have a world in which, yes, growth is very slow, but the cycles are relatively aligned. And of course, the slowdown due to COVID or the sharp halt due to COVID makes that even more the case. And we have a world in which inflation is not a real threat. And so in that sense, the bad news is good news. And I think that is one of the contributing factors to the success on the macro coordination front. The second irony is that the disease that we're all facing is making the bad behavior and the short-sightedness of government more obvious than perhaps it's ever been. The failures of the Johnson government in the UK or the Trump administration in the US or the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, are quite acute and quite obvious. But, excuse me, but that is not enough to immediately rectify the situation. There is no mean reversion in the short term. There is no immediate punishment. There may be a punishment in the sense of the elections in the future. There may be a punishment in the sense of protests in the streets in Sao Paulo as well as Minneapolis. But the transparency is not enough, I guess is the way to put it. That we have just seen people's errors become obvious so quickly, and yet the changing of tack by government is not there. The third irony, as I mentioned, is a world in which central bankers are more trusted than doctors, and I don't think that that's a lasting state of affairs. I do think it's just a reminder, a chastening reminder about technocrats, that is not fundamentally what drives people's acceptance of our recommendations. And doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be technocrats and try to write down the right policies, but that as for all the failings in economics, our friends and colleagues in political opinion studies have not yet delivered a satisfactory explanation of those as well. Fourthly, I think it is related that the true global public good, which would be the creation of a vaccine and the creation of successful treatments, if not vaccine for this disease, and how to provide this around the world, is the thing that's getting the least direct support. Now, this is in part directly at the feet of the Trump administration, that their resolute ideological refusal to engage in multilateral behavior, their belief that matters should always be done on a national basis, is, of course, one of the main barriers to having collective action on vaccines, antivirals, sharing of intellectual property rights, sharing of their distribution. And it is interesting and in context hopeful to see the EU, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, many of the countries joined with them in CPTPP, but even in lip service terms, at least the Chinese and the Japanese governments as well, talking about some common humanity on this. And again, I think the irony that something where more than anything else, the fate of the poor and the fate of the weak affect directly the fate of the rich and strong is where we have the least agreement, just shows the power of dangerous ideology in politics, whatever our rationality. Fifth irony, as already mentioned, but I think the repercussions remain to be seen, is that how much better some developing countries and emerging markets have done than some rich countries in coping with the crisis, conditional on their economic resources and their societies. Now, some of this may turn out to be a biological fact, that these are countries where the demographics are more favorable, fewer old people. The old people have survived more diseases. The climate conditions are different. The exposure to related diseases is different. It may be accidents of history that through the misfortunes of sub-Saharan Africa, those governments are more practiced in dealing with pandemics. But I think this is a huge irony to go with much of the upheaval in perceptions of both China and the US. And that we have to ask how international cooperation goes forward in a world where, as my colleague Arvind Subramanian has written about, a G-2, that the largest and strongest economies are not in a leadership position. And then finally, to return to something which some of you have heard me say before, going back to work I was doing on central bank independence now more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that ultimately institutions are endogenous to interests. We have put a lot of faith since 1945 in the idea that we can build institutions that constrain behavior of governments and that change incentives. And what we've seen, unfortunately, but I think predictably, is that the institutions only survive as vehicles for the state's involved interests. That doesn't mean you can't have cooperation and enlightened interest, but it means that the way you get there is through convincing the individual state actors to behave that way, and then the institutions get supported or take form to reflect that. I do not see a future in which the IMF or the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization becomes a binding actor on others. Now, you may say that is obvious, and we've always known that, but the agenda, both intellectually and in policy, hasn't changed to reflect that. And so to end on a positive note, I think the fact that we did have the success of the G20 in the first in the North Atlantic financial crisis, it's I think what should be the name of 2008 to 2010, and the G20 on currencies in recent years, and then on monetary policy and to some degree fiscal policy at present, does give one hope that where the states, meaning the governments, can be bought in, a group can make a difference. Going back to my original point, when it's a common push against a common threat and it's about behavior and not outcomes. Thank you very much.